I spend a lot of my downtime daydreaming. My future home and my kitchen, the family I want to have and cultivate, my backyard with the garden and pond, and finally my workshop. It's these dreams that I have that help me stay motivated to produce YouTube videos and continue working hard in the current profession I'm in. What also falls in the same daydreams are my inspiration for projects like this one. I bought this piece of walnut at my local woodworking store because it honestly called to me. I'm not sure why. I had the goal to buy it and try to flip it. My first thought was salt cellars because I was just shocked by the price online. But when I got down to making one, it just felt lifeless and it felt like I was stripping the wood from the beauty that it had held within. What you can't tell here is that I've been sitting with this piece of wood for about 2 months now, pondering what it should become. And then finally, one early morning, an idea struck me and I started drawing. Here's my plans. In the beginning, we started by cutting the top, bottom, and sides. I then jumped to cutting the 45-degree edges on each piece, and then proceeded to cut the long taper on the sides of the light. And if you didn't know, that's what we're building here, a light. Yes, you're seeing this right. This is real time. Fortunately for you, I'm going to cut this clip and then I'm going to move on to something dangerous because of how awful my bandsaw was at cutting this wood. Yes, the blade is dull, and yes, I'm lazy and dangerous. Sometimes I look back and I'm just like, why didn't you replace the blade? But what you're not getting in all this video is how my phone kept overheating and the garage is about 110 degrees. Arizona's summer heat is brutal, and sometimes it's just too hot to deal with anything. With the first taper complete, we transfer that shape over to the other side and move back to the miter saw. This is the dangerous part I was talking about earlier. If you can't tell, I love this tool. It does fill most of the problems I have not having to table saw, but I definitely really want to get a table saw in the future. I just don't want to invest in one that's not gonna save my finger if I accidentally get it stuck in it one day. And that's why I'm hoping to save up some money for a saw stop in the future as well. If you can't tell, right here I'm like really cautious about how I'm cutting this piece of wood. What makes this so dangerous in particular is the miters are already cut on the piece of wood, and that means I have no meat on the actual piece to back up against the fence of the miter saw, and leads to the piece of wood wanting to slide around from side to side and to kind of occasionally flip up due to there just not being enough force on the back of it to keep it in place. And yeah, I was just like really hesitant cutting this. I do not recommend it. Now with the rough dimensions finished, we move on to all the glue preparation. I start by making sure my 45-degree cuts are clean and that we have no leftover bumps from the miter saw or the handsaw. Next, I set up the pieces that will be glued together, and in this case we're starting with the top being glued to the sides, followed by the bottom with the edge glued on the one corner. I had the original plan of using this great double-sided tape trick, but it failed because I only had Scotch tape on hand, and Scotch tape with double-sided tape didn't stick well enough together to add any clamp pressure, so I had to abandon that entirely. And this is a benefit of being in a hot garage in Arizona, is I was just able to sit there with my hands for about 5 minutes and just hold it myself, and eventually the glue set up enough to where it didn't shift or move, and the clamp force from my hands was plenty strong. Throughout this whole project, I'm only showing off one example of one corner because we're building a fancy square pretty much. So if you can do one corner, you can do the whole thing. I promise. With all the pieces glued up and a new belt added to the belt sander, we can move on to shaping the taper from the top to the sides to the bottom. Once all of those match, we then move on to hand sanding the top and the sides. Before we get to hand sanding the bottom, we have to add a hole in the middle of the board where the light is going to recess down a little bit and sit into the wood. Right here you see me referring to my plans to see how big of a hole I'll need to drill for the ball light to be recessed in the bottom board. But I ran into a problem here. Since the ball light has a flat bottom and I didn't compensate for that in the original drawing, it is no longer a perfect sphere that I'm referring to, and so I had to go and re-drill a larger hole to compensate for the changing dimensions in the original plans. So the hole went from 2.5 inches to 3 inches, and this is why you see me drilling a larger hole over the original 2.5 inch hole that was there previously. You also see me switch from the hole saw to the router, and the reason I did this is because the hole saw will give me a perfect template for my router bits to kind of reference off of while I'm routing out the bulk of the material. I actually thought this was such a kind of perfect idea, and it worked out great, and I still got my perfectly circular shape, and I was able to use the router without any jig hooked up or waiting on my CNC to actually do the bulk of the work. So this was a grade A idea, in my opinion. Here's about 30 seconds of chisel ASMR for all you ASMR freaks out there. Enjoy. Now that the hole for the light is drilled, we are now moving on to sanding all the places that I will struggle with if the top and sides and the bottom were all joined together. So, starting with 100 grit and working my way up to 240 grit, I sand the bottom face facing up and all the faces facing inwards towards the light on the side and top piece. Because sanding is such a laborious task and you're kind of bored doing it most of the time, I tend to think about a lot of stuff during these moments, but in this case, as I'm working on this piece, I wasn't quite sure on how I was going to kind of finish everything. And this is right around the time I thought, am I going to route the edges or am I going to keep them straight? Am I going to round the sides of the square to make it look more organic? I wasn't sure. But I was also thinking about how would I strengthen these glue joints on the corners, and that's when I remembered I had some brass rods. That's when I realized I could kill two birds with one stone. The rod will add a great contrasting appeal with the wood, and with a little epoxy and it being passed through both sides of the pieces of wood, it would reinforce that glue joint. It was also in this moment that I could see 3 brass rods transfer from the bottom piece to the floating side, looking like it was some internal skeleton of the light. I also continued this brass rod look with the last glue joint to further the skeleton idea. So with the new idea solidified, we started marking the holes and then drilling the holes, getting prepared for the brass rods to be inserted. This is for all you non-visual people out there. Here's the first glimpse of what the project is gonna look like. Jumping ahead because my phone overheated, I cut the rods down, and now with the use of black resin, I'm setting the rods in place to cure overnight. After those are set in place, I'm moving on to the corner joints of the top and side piece. This is where I will drill more holes and set more brass rods in place to strengthen the joint and add that beautiful accent, as I mentioned earlier. With all the brass finally set in the piece, I also used the excess resin left over to top off those knots so that I didn't have to worry about them ever getting loose over time. Resin will actually really help here because knots tend to fall loose or break up into smaller pieces with time, just in my experience. So having the resin in there will ensure that they stay in place for a long time so that all of us can enjoy the character they add while the light is in use. With everything set, we start by cutting the excess back to the wood surface on the bandsaw. Following the bandsaw, we then bring it back to the belt sander and sand it flush to the surface of the wood. It's also around this time that I made the decision to round the edges of the floating side. On top of this, I decided to round the top two corners as well. With some more sanding done off camera to ensure that everything has a clean surface before I start this final glue up, we get to add the blue tape, poke the holes where the resin's gonna sit for the brass rods, and then finally apply the glue to the final miter joints. And finally, the top and sides get to join the bottom piece. This is what woodworking's about, baby. Finishing a project up. Here's another quick glimpse with the clamps adding some pressure on that final joint. As mentioned earlier, I pretty much replicated the same thing on every corner. So with that being said, the final corner is glued and I rounded it and added those 3 brass rods that I mentioned earlier as well. And now we are finally on the sanding of the entire piece. This took a while, but it really paid off. And I restarted back to 100 grit for every edge, and I worked my way up to 1000 grit. And man, must I say, this puppy was smooth. I decided for a final design element, I would keep that bottom right corner square since the floating piece above it was rounded over. I'm not sure why this felt right, but it did. And you know what they say, be there or be square, because you're not around. And just like every YouTube video, this one must come to an end. Thanks for watching, and have a lovely week. I'll see you later.